do that. It's 7 o'clock, and we have a perhaps long meeting tonight, so let's get started. Good evening. Welcome to the March 8th, 2023 meeting of the Southampton Town Conservation Board. In accordance with the Town Board's adoption of Local Law Number 14 of 2022, the Board's meetings are being held both in person at Town Hall and via video conference through Zoom webinar. The link to participate in this meeting via video conference can be found on the town's website at the Town Clerk's Agendas and Meetings portal. You can watch also the live stream video and submit written comments for the public record through the town website. If you are attending via Zoom and wish to speak during the meeting, then please click the raise hand icon. As a reminder to all applicants, agents, and members of the public who wish to speak at the meeting, please state your name and hamlet of residence for the record. Thank you. Now, would you please all rise and join us in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
There are 4 of us here in person tonight, and one of us is on Zoom. Zeb is on Zoom to join us. And Zeb, if you want to speak, just raise your hand or get Kevin's attention, and then you can have a time to speak. Acceptance of the February 22nd, 2023 meetings as written or amended. What's your pleasure?
Move to accept the minutes as presented.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
And yes, and Zeb, you can vote, but you're not counted as part of the quorum.
Right.
Would you like me to do that with the, keep my volume on?
Yes.
Sure,
Okay.
sure. Yeah, it makes it sound like there are more people here.
Good.
Public hearings, A021027, Marcin Fiesnes and Kathleen Cuomo Fiesnes. And Susanna, you may present your application. This has been open and adjourned in the past, but never been presented to the board.
Good evening, Susanna Herman and Consultants, 1319 North Sea Road, Southampton. Kathleen Como Vicines, who's the homeowner, is here tonight as well, should you have any questions of her. I have some materials to hand up as well. So this property is located at 132 Cold Spring Point Road. The Cuomo family has owned the property for over 60 years. Some of you were probably on the board when this exact same house was approved in 2014. This is the survey that we're looking at here. So we're proposing a 2-story house with a footprint of 1,285 square feet on pilings, with some minimal decking on the east side for entry, and then a 15-foot wide deck on the west side. So this is the exact same project that this board approved in 2014. It's the same site plan with 2 notable exceptions. The first exception is back then, we weren't allowed to do alternative septic systems. So the approved plan had a traditional conventional system with a retaining wall around it, which was 5 to 6 feet high as proposed. The new plan has an IA system with a shallow drain field septic system, which would not require a retaining wall. and would only require that the grade be raised 1.5 to 2 feet in that front yard area. The other significant change to the site plan is that the wetlands line has changed since it was originally submitted in 2011. So Karina's handing up a few handouts. I have photographs of the site, including some aerial photographs, as well as a copy of the permit that was approved in 2014. And if you take a look at that, it's the exact same house, the same decks, the same driveway. You'll see that the septic system is different. There's no longer a retaining wall. And you'll see that the wetlands line has been changed. So as I mentioned, the original application was submitted in 2011, and the project was approved in 2014. And subsequently, we filed a covenant for the buffer area, provided a plantings plan, provided updated surveys, and the permit was released in 2017. It was then subsequently renewed a few times, and then when we went to renew the permit again in 2019, the wetlands line at that point was 8 years old. So the wetlands line was reflagged. At that time, we had to submit a new application. So an application was filed in 2021, and since that time, we've been trying to get everything on the survey and work with staff to provide a drainage plan, etc. So you should have,
A book.
it's not that much. I'll go through it quickly just to explain what you should have in your hands. You should have a copy of the permit from 2014. You should have a package of photographs from me. You should have a copy of the of the permit for the property adjacent to the east. And you should have a package from Mrs. Cuomo, which includes a letter from her and some photographs.
Tom, is there an aerial in there?
George, if you look at the last page of the photographs, I did include an aerial view, as well as from the town GIS site, they have an oblique imagery, which is sort of at an angle.
No, thank you. Oh, this-
So unfortunately, they were unable to do the construction when the project was originally approved several years ago. I'll let Mrs. Cuomo address that when she comes up in a few minutes. If they had built at that time, the house would be there, and we'd have the exact same situation as we're currently proposing. Except now we can do an upgraded septic system, do an IA septic system. There are some adjustments that yet can be made, but I wanted the board to see this version of the proposed project as it is what the family would like to do, as it is exactly what was approved previously by this board. There's some adjustments that could be made. We are proposing to use open grate decking in order to reduce any potential runoff. There are some reductions in proposed fill that can be made.
Open grate decking?
Decking for the proposed decks.
Okay.
There's decks on, there's a 15-foot wide deck.
And there's
here.
already a catwalk.
Right, there's a catwalk that was approved several years ago. There was a pre-existing bulkhead that was replaced, and that was all done with all the permits in place from the trustees. That was 2018, 2017?
I think maybe 15.
2015, sorry. That's one thing that had to be done in the interim instead of building the house. They had to spend money replacing that failing boat slip that had to be refurbished. The bulkhead was in need of repair. So money had to be spent on that instead of going forward with the house project right away. And then other things intervened as well, but I'll let her address that. But I did want to mention that the deck on the east side, we would propose to be open grade decking in order to reduce potential for runoff. And it's an elevated deck. The proposed first floor elevation is 10 feet. So we're approximately 5 to 6 feet above grade at that point. The decking on the east side is primarily entry. And there probably are some ways that we can reconfigure that to reduce that footprint a little bit. So we're working on that as well. We're also working on the drainage plan. We had submitted a draft drainage plan with a better dry well solution than was previously approved. We approved 2014 version of dry wells doesn't really work with the proposed grades at that time and separation to groundwater. So upon looking at that more closely, we provided a draft plan which Marty Shea was kind enough to give some feedback on. So we're working with our engineer to refine that to reduce fill even farther. We would be using helical piles under the house. It would be an open piling foundation. And helical piles would be used to reduce to the greatest extent the disturbance on the property. And as I mentioned before, a revegetation plan was submitted with the original application and approved, and that would be augmented as needed. We would be using native vegetation over the entire property. Everything that's not covered by house or driveway would be revegetated. And there was a plan that I provided at the last go-around, which included beach grass and beach plum and bayberry bushes. So the entire property would be naturally vegetated. As I mentioned, I provided a permit for the adjacent property to the east. That house has a footprint of 1,006 square feet. It's in approximately the same location. At the time that that was approved, it had a wetland setback that was more equivalent to the original approval. But if you look at the survey, it's right smack next to this one. So this proposed house would be approximately the same order of magnitude, size, location, same distance from the street. The main difference in appearance between the two houses would be we would not have a 8-foot-high retaining wall enclosing the septic system. Exaggerated. That septic system, the top of the wall is elevation 9. Grade is about 2.5. So it's a 6.5-foot wall. So we've eliminated that from this project. So the visual impact will be much less structure, much less fill would be needed for this project compared to the project next door and as compared to the previously approved project at this site. So with that, unless you have any questions immediately of me, I know Kathleen Cuomo would.
Just a comment. Those are great things that you have expressed. I was listening for something I didn't hear. When an application, even if it's an application that is about to be expired and is requesting a renewal, even with that, Chapter 325 specifies that if field conditions change, then there's an opportunity to review that application. It's not an automatic renewal. And this is a very significant expansion of wetlands landward in a relatively short time, which positions the construction very close to the wetland line and leaves the buffer quite a bit short of the recommended buffer. So what I think about when I see an application like this is, how can we be creative to expand that buffer? I don't have the answer to that. I was listening for something that you would have a gem to suggest that would expand that. This is not a question, this is just a way I'm thinking right now. So that's fine for what you've done right now. Then your client can speak, and I want
Right.
Maury to speak too, and then there'll be more discussion.
I appreciate your comments, and as you probably know, I've been coming before this board as long, as, I hate to admit, I think it's like 27 years now, which makes me feel very old. But I'm always looking for how we can improve the project and provide the homeowner with a home that they can be happy with. And that's my objective here, and I think we have some room here to work with the property. We can't go any closer to the street. We can't move it side to side. So we are trying to do the best that we can with what we've got here and provide them something that is reasonable and fair, considering that what was approved previously on the same property.
And there is a question that we don't have the answer to, and that is, suppose we were to move the timeline 10 years more, what would the wetland line look like? In other words, where is that wetland line going to be relative to the house in 10 years? We don't know that answer.
It'll be the same as it is to all of the houses on Cold Spring Point Road, many of which have been recently approved and constructed as well. So, houses approved next door, that was about the same size that we're asking for here. House was approved on the other side, adjacent to the west, which you may recall, it's a substantially larger house, about 4,000 square feet. It's a different situation, it's a different property, I understand that, and I know you address each property on its own merits. But I think the property to the east is very similar, and the wetlands are now closer to that house than when that was approved. So we're trying to do the best with what we've got. And as I mentioned, the property has been owned by this family for over 60 years. And circumstances have prevented them from constructing on the property until now. They're finally at the situation in their lives where they can make this happen. So we're trying to find a fair solution for them.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Kathleen Cuomo for tennis, and I thank you for listening to me, members of the board and our community. I've enclosed a letter to you and some pictures of my childhood on the property. My grandparents settled Cold Spring Point Road in 1954. My dad was drafted. They bought a piece of land, my grandparents, and they built. I've been going there since I was born, and we built a small bungalow, as did my first and second, their brothers and sisters there. That was a house on the Bayside. Years later, grandfather bought the piece of land that I am now asking you to permit me to build. We had hoped, or he had thought that my dad would build it. Unfortunately, grandfather died and financial circumstances happened, and dad was putting us through college and the house wasn't built. But when my grandmother died in the year 2000, the house bungalow on the Bayside was given to my Aunt Joanna, who does, let us use it, but she owns that house, and we are her guests there. My dad thought we would start building the house in 2012, about the time we realized what state of disrepair the bulkhead was. Dad quickly learned how complicated the process was with waterfront property. So he asked my husband and I to help him with it, and we agreed to. That's the time we first hired end consultants to help us with this process. What happened in 2012 was Hurricane Sandy. As you all remember, the East Coast was decimated. There were multiple changes as a result in what could be done, what building types you wanted to be done, and also applications got all bog-necked, and non-emergency applications were put to the back of government agencies. Also at this time, what happened, my mother fell during Hurricane Sandy and became a quadriplegic. So my dad had some heart attacks as a result of the stress of this, and even though I was working full-time, I became their primary caregiver, taking care of them. But we kept trying to push forth getting this project moved ahead. Soon after my mother passed in 2015, we did have, started to receive some permits, and we immediately hired a contractor, my husband and I, because the property had been gifted by my parents in 2012 to us. So we did the bulkhead, and we next planned on focus on building the house. But my mother-in-law fell in 2015, and since that time she's been totally bedridden. She lives in Poland, and we facilitate her home care as well. My husband goes every 90 days to Poland to make sure that her status is okay. Between taking care of my father, me here in the States, and working, and my husband working and going back and forth to Poland, our hands have been very tied. The demands, we saw the demands of managing all this elder care. We asked consultants to start renewing our permits, and they started to. The result of COVID and changes in technology and things, it just made this a big process. We had to get new land surveys, we had to get new engineers. Believe it or not, it takes a long time to do that and to organize everything. I think to get my survey done took me months to get Mr. Cornwith out there. So it does seem like it took a long time. We were ready to do it. With COVID happening, it added to the confusion and the difficulty of organizing different professional services and even coming to meetings and talking to people in town. I have there some pictures of me in 1961 with my grandparents on the beach. I have there some pictures of my dad, his 90th birthday on my grandmother's deck in 2020. It was his last. Where my husband and I are now retired, my parents are dead. His mother is doing the best she can, but we're selling our house in Brooklyn, and we are ready to build, and we're just beseeching you to give us your previously approved permit again, once again. We have always been good stewards of the land. We don't try to put in lawns and privets. We don't try to do things overdone. We just want to be part of the community that I've known since I was born. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Any questions?
No, maybe just make sure and sign on the sheet so we have your name. For the
I did.
record.
Thank you
Oh,
very
great.
much, sir.
Thank you.
I was the first.
Oh,
I was very
great.
anxious to speak with you. And I think my letter's a little clearer and more detailed, but I think you get my feelings and my love of the land. Thank you.
Good evening, I'm Marty Shea, Chief Environmental Analyst for the town. There is a preliminary advisory report on file dated August 22nd, 2022. The applicant is indeed blessed to have this land. This is a breathtaking area. Abundant shellfish and wildlife, clean surface waters, great area to kayak and paddleboard in, but an extremely sensitive area, environmentally, a very fragile area, an area that's very vulnerable to flooding. It's one of the areas of the town where we're beginning to see localized impacts of rising sea level and climate change. in that this is not the only property in the area where the title regimes are advancing landward. I have a bunch of handouts. The applicant had provided many of the same documents. I won't provide those papers. But the first thing that I'd like to hand out is two FEMA maps. And the first one is showing the limit of moderate wave action and how it relates to the subject property. And what you'll see is the subject property is outlined in red, and the limit of moderate wave action goes almost 2/3 into this lot. The second drawings I'd like to hand out are drawings that also show the AE flood zone in this area. The property is located in 86, meaning that the minimum finished first floor needs to be at 8. When you look at the mapping of the limit of moderate wave action, you can really get a sense of how vulnerable this entire area is to flooding. Thus, the reason why, consistent with the state building code, that the applicant is proposing to elevate the house on pilings. As indicated, the wetland boundary has advanced significantly landward on this property by about 20 feet, and that has changed the proposed wetland setbacks considerably. I think you have a copy of the prior Conservation Board permit that the applicant had provided, and what you'll see in that permit is that when this same plan was previously approved for this site, the residence was as far back as 41 feet from wetlands. Now it's as close as 18 feet. The decks, which likewise were previously further away, are as close as 19 feet and inclusive of the entry stairway, which the applicant has indicated they're going to take a second look at. That appears to be even closer at about 14 feet. So this is a very constrained lot. So one of the things that the applicant is required to do on properties such as this, consistent with the wetland permit issuance standards set forth in section 325-9D of the code, is to evaluate practicable alternatives. In the interest of seeing if there's a way to be more creative with the design in order to lessen the degree of nonconformity, that is to lessen the intended structural coverage, to maximize building setbacks for the improvement, and to dedicate as much of that land as possible, not only as a wetland preservation area and naturally vegetated wetland non-disturbance, non-fertilization buffer, but also as a native landscape. One of the things that I do when applications like this are received is, notwithstanding that the circumstance, individual properties are different. I do look at neighboring parcels where Conservation Board permits have been approved. And the abutting lot to the east and northeast was of particular interest because the living area coverage that this board approved on that property was between 900 square feet and 1,000 square feet. And this is a property which has similar constraints, but wherein the improvements are cited further back from the wetlands. So rather than go forward with the same plan that calls for 1,285 square feet in terms of the footprint, it would be a two-story house. It seemed appropriate in the interest of better protecting the wetland resources and an acknowledgement of the vulnerability of the area to flooding, the advancing wetland boundary, and the importance of this area to fish and wildlife, that we look to reduce the scale of construction. So initially, when I forwarded the preliminary advisory report, I think I was looking for a decrease of the house footprint to close to 700 square feet. As a consequence of ongoing communications with the applicant, I reconsidered that and more recently advised the applicant that I think it would be appropriate on this property to reduce the square footage of the footprint of the house to about 900 square feet, more on par with the permitted development on the abutting lot to the east and northeast. And the reduction of the house to 900 doesn't essentially change the wetland setbacks for the house because, as indicated correctly by the applicant, the house cannot be pushed closer to the road. But if you go with the same shape of the house, what it does allow for is to reorient the elevated deck on the western side of the house so that rather than run in a generalized north-south direction, that deck could be built to run in a east-west direction, thereby increasing setbacks for the side deck, which also allows for expansion of the parallel covenanted naturally vegetated buffer. Now, in my latest email recommendations to the applicant dated February 23rd of this year, again, I recommended that the house, the dwelling footprint, be reduced to a maximum of 900 square feet. And the dimensions I provided were 29 by 31 feet. And the reason I chose those dimensions is the 29 feet width of the reduced house would be the same as the proposed width of the new dwelling as shown on the applicant's plans, but the length of the house would be reduced. That structure you might gain a couple feet because of scaling down of the house. So your closest setback would increase from 18 feet to 20 feet landward of wetlands. But by reorienting the deck in an east-west direction, you could build a deck of the same size and the dimensions of the proposed deck are 15 feet by 28 feet. But if you align that deck with the north side of the proposed dwelling, you would increase its closest setback to wetlands to up to 31 feet. And of course, we always advise applicants that if they have an interest in building a more modern house, there's always the opportunity to have a rooftop deck as well in order to provide additional exterior recreational space. As indicated, I have been working with the applicant on the drainage plan as well. Although the applicant had come forward with a concept plan for subsurface drainage chambers using Coltech technology, I thought the amount of fill that they wanted to place in order to raise those drainage chambers was excessive. So I did discuss that with the town engineer, who indicated that yes, indeed, the amount of fill deposition could be lessened. And it sounds like the applicant is amenable to continuing to work with me on the needed modifications to the drainage plans. Once we bring to resolution what the appropriate footprint for the house and appropriate position of the decks would be, I then can proceed with working with the applicant to finalize the covenanted wetland preservation area, the covenanted naturally vegetated wetland non-disturbance, non-fertilization buffer, and as well as work towards a finalized native landscape plan. As is customary for any lots that come before this board on Cold Spring Point Road, because the road is a private road and it's very narrow, and many of the shoulders, inclusive of the shoulder on this property, has natural vegetative cover. Acknowledging that that shoulder is needed for the purposes of temporary construction vehicle parking, I always ask the applicants to agree to, upon completion of construction, to revegetate that shoulder back to native plants consistent with the character of Cold Spring Point. You'll notice that Cold Spring Point is kind of a mix of properties that are very naturalized in terms of native cover and properties that still have some significant lawn. But as these properties come before this board, we're doing whatever we can to encourage these property owners to landscape with native vegetation. When you live in an area like this, and again, I would repeat what I started with, that the applicant is extremely blessed to have this property. This is a very unique area. But with that gift comes a need to do everything possible to be the best possible environmental steward of this land, of the wetland resources, of the surface waters. I obviously have no issue with the applicant building a home on this lot. I just think the applicant needs to be more respectful of the fragile environment that they're in, and to do whatever they can to reduce the house and deck coverage, to look at the possibility of shifting those decks further back, because all that will be beneficial in terms of protecting the wetlands and surface water quality. The landowner has expressed that their interest is in moving out here from, I think she said, Brooklyn, and spending many years at this property. So part of what I do is not only ensuring that landowners can have reasonable use of the property, but ensuring that the area they move into remains special, that we still have those clean surface waters, we still have that great area to recreate in, we still have that abundant wildlife. And these are the very things that attract people to the Cold Spring Point area. So, in summation, I just, I think, acknowledging the constraints of this property, the changes we're seeing to this property in terms of more extensive wetlands, the vulnerability of this flooding, that the applicant needs to give a little bit more back to the natural environment and go back to the drawing board and see if this house size can be reduced closer to 900 square feet. One of the things that can be helpful in looking at options, design options, is to look at the intended floor plan of the house. I don't think the applicant has provided that yet, but that sometimes puts us in a better position to see what modifications we can make without putting any undue burdens on the applicant in terms of their future home. Yes, my goal is to protect the environment, but I also want to make sure that the landowner builds a home here that they're very pleased with. So in that regard, I'm happy to continue to work with the landowner and their agent to look at whether or not the scale of construction can be reduced in the interest of better protecting the environment. Remember, this is vacant land. The code requires a minimum building setback of 125 feet and a minimum buffer of 100 feet. We only have a construction setback of 20 feet and a buffer, minimum buffer setback of about 20 feet or even 18 feet. So they're really asking for significant variances on this property. So I do think that the applicant needs to give additional thought to reducing the coverage at this site. Thank you.
Thank you, Marty, for your comments. I just wanted to add that we did provide in the previous application a very basic floor plan. I can take a look at that and provide that as well and meet with staff. As I mentioned, there is some room for improvement as well as far as the decks are concerned. I don't think we're prepared at this moment to say we'll reduce the footprint to 900 square feet, but we will look at what we've got, look at the floor plan, and see if we can do what we can to reduce the overall footprint. It's going to take some work, and it may be very marginal benefit as far as wetland setbacks are concerned. But I think we're willing to work with the board to try to improve what we've got. But we'll need a little time to do that. So.
Thank you. That's what is called for right now. There's no question you can build a house here. It's these details. We have to respond to that migrating wetland line. And you've heard the testimony. You've been here long enough. You understand the deal. See what you can come up with. And let's see if we can find something that works. How much time do you need? You need to adjourn this to a later date. Let's see if there's anybody in the public who wants to speak. Is there anyone in the public who wants to speak on this application? Anybody on Zoom, Kevin?
No one on Zoom.
Okay, thank you. So, we,
4 weeks would probably
4
be
weeks. we're
our
look-
preference.
Okay.
April 26th is a possibility, later is a better possibility for the number of people that are scheduled, but
The homeowners will be in Poland again in April, I'm sorry, in May. So if we could have the end of April,
April 26th?
We can
please,
do that,
if that's possible.
sure.
Let's see if anyone else wants to
Okay.
speak. and
Yeah, we did that.
then- Okay.
Is there a motion to adjourn till April 26th?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
W 220109. Oh, actually, I have, no, I don't have. Yes, this goes there too. 48 White's Lane LLC.
This is a new hearing. We do have affidavits of posting and mailing, so the board has jurisdiction to open the hearing.
Thank you.
Good evening for the applicant, Robert Marcinsick, O'Shea Marcinsick in Bruin, 250 North Sea Road, Southampton. Good evening. This application is submitted pursuant to Southampton Town Code Section 325C to challenge the determination by the Environmental Division that wetlands exist on the subject property located at 48 White's Lane. 48 White's Lane is located on the south side of White's Lane, approximately 1,000 feet west of the intersection of White's Lane and North McGee Street in Tuckahoe. The property was created in 1981 as part of the subdivision map of Southampton Oaks, which was filed on August 14, 1981. It is known and identified as lot number 30 on that particular subdivision map. Property is currently comprised of approximately 60,450 square feet. It is located in an R80 zoning district. Upon filing of the map, however, the parcel was located in an R40 zoning district. The property is now zoned R80, but since the property has been held in single and separate ownership from adjacent parcels since the time of the filing of the map, the parcel is entitled to R40 zoning setbacks, just for your information. The character of the neighborhood is shown in the Southampton Oaks subdivision development chart and map, which we included in the exhibit packet that you all should have in front of you now. These documents show that the lot area and house size on each parcel in the Southampton Oaks subdivision and the residential improvements on each of those lots in the subdivision. It shows that there are 49 lots in that subdivision. All are approximately 1 acre in size, in keeping with the R40 zoning in effect at the time of the filing of the map. 45 of the 49 lots are currently improved with single-family residences. Therefore, 92% of the subdivision has been developed. Smallest house is about 1,450 square feet. The largest is over 5,000 square feet. The average house is approximately 3,000, and 38 of the improved properties in the subdivision have pools, representing about 85%. So, we've included an aerial photograph of the area taken in 2022 as Exhibit B. The subject parcel on that photograph is shown, is outlined in orange. The character of the neighborhood has therefore been well established. Basically, all the lots there have approximately 3,000 square foot homes with pools, and we submit that our proposed development is not anything out of the ordinary in the neighborhood. The main issue in this matter is the presence of wetlands on the property, which could affect the development of of the subject property. We have not received any communication from area residents in opposition to our application or our jurisdictional challenge. In fact, we've received 2 letters, which we've included as Exhibit C in support of our jurisdictional appeal. One of the residents lives at 42 White's Lane, and the other at 47 White Oak Lane. There have been numerous documents submitted by the applicant into the record prior to today's public hearing. We basically included all of those in the exhibit packet in an effort to have them all readily available for your review. That is listed in Exhibit D in the exhibit packet. You'll find 2 reports submitted by Marty Shea to the Conservation Board, an initial report as well as a supplemental report to the Conservation Board. There are also 2 reports submitted in response to each of those reports by Dr. Ronald Abrams from Drew Associates. There's a report by Daphne Vaughn from Surfside Environmental Planning in response to Marty Shea's report, as well as a letter report by Sean Barron regarding the soil test and the presence of wetlands on site. There are also 2 responses to Marty's report prepared by Brian Horning, who is the principal of 48 White's Lane LLC, and basically is the applicant in this application. A plant guide regarding red maples trees issued by the United States Department of Agriculture is also included in the exhibit packet. There are documents showing the surrounding area hydrology, known wetlands in the vicinity of 48 White's Lane, as well as photos of 48 White's Lane taken on February 10th, 2022, May 13th, 2022, and October 6th, 2022, basically during the winter, spring, and fall seasons. As indicated, there were 2 reports submitted by Marty Shea to the Conservation Board. In this matter, both are extensive, very detailed, as is usual for most of Marty's reports. However, in addition to the purported presence of wetlands that are set forth in that report, there are a couple other inaccuracies in reports that need to be addressed and clarified for the record. First one is that Marty Shea claims that the applicant has not disputed the presence of wetlands on the property, but it only calls into question the types of wetlands that warrant protection. However, the applicant does in fact dispute the presence of wetlands on site and has filed this jurisdictional appeal as a result. The applicant did provide a history of the site in an effort to show there may have been some evidence of wetlands on the property at one time, but has always maintained that there are no wetlands present on the subject property. The applicant was merely hypothesizing why the town may have previously found there to be wetlands on the property. In that regard, the applicant has pointed out that prior stormwater runoff condition that has impacted the subject property may have created what appeared to be wetlands for a time, but the addition of drainage structures along White's Lane has alleviated what had been previously a prior favorable condition for wetlands to exist on the subject property. In that regard, White's Lane was, we submit, first constructed somewhere around 1900 to 1910. It was constructed in an ill-advised manner, which led to stormwater runoff running onto the subject property. White's Lane traversed over property with varying elevations, and the lack of proper engineering in the installation of the roadway allowed stormwater runoff to flow into the lower elevations of the property for many years. And this created a condition where wetlands may have grown. Sometime thereafter, however, drainage structures were installed directly in front of 48 White's Lane in an effort to remedy this long-standing drainage problem on the property, and by installing the road drainage system directly in front of 48 White's Lane, persistent stormwater runoff problem that had plagued the property for many years was ameliorated. So while there may possibly have been wetlands on the property at one time, the applicant strongly maintains these wetlands no longer exist on the property. The other issue or inaccuracy that we'd like to address is that Marty claims that there was a recognition of wetlands on the subject parcel by myself in connection with a 2019 wetlands boundary jurisdictional appeal filed for property at 49 White Oak Lane, the owner of which I represented at the time. 48 White Oak Lane is located adjacent and immediately to the south of the subject property. I submit that I made no such recognition of wetlands on the subject property. I have no educational training in that regard, experience in identifying wetlands, and I'm not qualified to give an opinion as to the presence of wetlands on the property. The only so-called recognition was an acknowledgement of a wetlands flagging by the town whereby purported wetlands were said to exist on the subject property during the application process for 49 White Oak Lane. However, the presence of wetlands or the lack thereof on the subject property was largely irrelevant to the challenge regarding the existence of wetlands on 48 White Oak Lane on that property. It is, and always has been, our position that for many years there's been no evidence of wetlands on the property. As further evidence of the lack of wetlands on the property, we point to the letter of non-jurisdiction, which was dated March 1st, 2022, received by the New York State DEC, which is included in the exhibit packet as Exhibit E. Further historical evidence of the lack of wetlands on the property. We have submitted correspondence set on April 30th, 1981 by then Chairman of the Southampton Town Planning Board, Roy L. Wines, to the then Chairman of this board, the Southampton Conservation Board, Gil Foster, and also to Thomas Rowinski, who was President of the Southampton Town Trustees, requesting that they evaluate and make any recommendations that they would care to make with regard to the proposed Southampton Oaks subdivision. That correspondence is shown in Exhibit F in the exhibit packet. There was a written response received from the Board of Trustees that was dated May 1 of 1981, which stated there was a very small amount of wetlands on Lot 27 and 28, but it failed to note or mention any environmental or wetlands concerns with regard to Lot 30, which again is the subject parcel located at 48 Whites Lane. That response is included as Exhibit G in our exhibit packet. There was also a written response from the Southampton Town Conservation Board at that time, as well as the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, which failed to note any wetlands affecting the subject property. Those responses were made part of the Southampton Town Planning Board final staff report in connection with the Southampton Oaks subdivision on May 28, 1981. While the staff report indicated there were freshwater wetlands on lot numbers 4, 27, and 28 of the subdivision, the report failed to indicate any concerns whatsoever or wetland issues regarding lot 30, which is again the subject parcel. The report did outline certain environmental concerns relating to other lots in the subdivision, but not 48 Whites Lane. That staff report is included in the exhibit packet as Exhibit H. In the planning staff report, it specifically states that the Conservation Board advised that Lot 4 of the subdivision is covering a significant freshwater wetland area. It should be evaluated by the New York State DEC. As is pertinent to this application, lot number 4 is approximately 600 feet from the subject parcel. The Conservation Board further advised that they felt that the building envelope on lot number 28 should not include the wetland area. And we submit that the wetland area on lot 28 is approximately 450 feet from the subject parcel. The town trustees' response stated that there is a very small amount of freshwater wetlands on lots 27 and 28, and I believe that this will not have any significant effect on the environment, but we will have to be very careful in a determination of property north of Whites Lane. That's basically what the town trustees had indicated at that time, and again, parcel lot number 30, south of Whites Lane, and that's 450 feet from lot number 28. So in the response by the New York DEC also indicated there were freshwater wetlands designated by the DEC, but only in the northeasterly portion of the site, on lots 27 and 28 as well. So, significant to note that none of these responses had anything to say about the occurrence of wetlands on the subject parcel, which was lot 30. Now, the substance of Marty Shea's report concludes that there are wetlands on the subject property due to the presence and dominance of wetland indicative vegetation on the subject property, namely red maple trees. Marty's report expressly states, and I quote, "By virtue of the dominance of facultative wetlands, trident red maple alone at the subject property, the area in question meets the statutory wetlands definition." The report concludes, and I quote again, "The town wetlands determination and boundary delineation at the subject property is consistent with the statutory directive that if an area exhibits a prevalence of dominance of wetlands indicator plants, the area meets the statutory definition of wetlands set forth in section 325-3 and thus needs to be regulated." However, as you will hear from our experts, Marty Shea's determination that there are wetlands on the property relies solely on the presence of one wetland species, red maples. Red maples are the most widespread, invasive, and abundant species of trees and are one of the most widely distributed trees in eastern North America. They are prolific seed producers and reproduce aggressively. They sprout, and while it is tolerant of waterlogged soils and flooding, it grows in the widest ranges of conditions of any North American species of trees. We provided a plant guide issued by the United States Department of Agriculture on red maples in Exhibit D to support that position. So, while all wetland areas may contain red maples, not all red maples are located in wetland areas. Marty's report relies on no other significant vegetative species indicative of wetlands on site other than those red maples. There's no mention of any waterlogged soils in his report. And however, I should say, as I said, though I'm no expert on wetlands identification, and the applicant has hired three experts, Dr. Ronald Abrams from Drew Associates, Daphne Vaughn from Surfside Environmental Planning, as well as Sean Barron. We would all invite the board to please come visit the site at their convenience. And at this point, that's all I have to say. And I believe that Dr. Abrams is on Zoom waiting to speak next, unless you have any specific questions of myself.
Thank you, Rob.
Okay. Hopefully he's there.
Kevin, do we have somebody on Zoom?
Yeah, we do.
And that's Dr. Abrams.
He's joining right now.
Thank you.
Good evening. Am I being heard?
Yes. Yes.
This is Dr. Ron Abrams, Drew Associates. I'm a consulting ecologist working on Long Island wetlands for 38 years. I have a PhD in ecology and a master's in biology. In the 80s, I was a DEC supervisor for wetlands and wildlife, and subsequently became a consultant. I served as on the board of governors of the Society for Conservation Biology. In the 90s, I taught at Long Island University in their environmental science master's program. And more recently, I've been publishing chapters and papers on conservation issues and educational modules for Elsevier's online conservation encyclopedias. I've submitted 2 reports. I'm not going to read them verbatim. I'm going to give you an overview of my opinion, which I generated after being requested late winter of '22 to take a look at this case at 48 White's Lane. Ironically, I've spent considerable time in the wetland across the north of the road when I did wetland work for Charlie Holmes on his property, so I am quite familiar with the area in some detail. I made site inspections through the spring into the summer, and simply put, I do not think this site contains the wetland as mapped by Mr. Shea. The character of this woodland is coastal successional woodland. It's typical of the higher ground in that general area. It's a mix of southern hardwoods, opportunistic species like the red maple, and has a fairly sparse understory. And I found no plant species there that require wetland conditions to thrive. I'm aware of Mr. Shea's initial and then subsequently modified characterizations of the site, first terming it a red maple swamp based on New York Natural Heritage's characterizations of habitats, but Marty relied on the original definition. A number of cases arose in the years since that first edition, and I think Marty fell victim to the same issue. A swamp must be some sort of basin or toe of a slope, which is not the case at White's Lane. In 2014, Natural Heritage changed their text to clarify that a basin must be part of the physical description or physical character of a red maple swamp, where water collects at low points to give wetland species what they need. We don't have that at 48 White's Lane. In the second round of characterizations, the town's viewpoint changed to focus on the species present only, ignoring the soils and hydrology, and I don't agree with that. In difficult cases, soils and hydrology are the way to resolve a controversial wetland. In earlier memos, Marty invoked some of the elements of the so-called federal three-parameter delineation method. This method is the industry standard, and it requires hydric soils and saturated soils to be part of that which supports wetland plants. In his more recent report, Mr. Shea dismissed the three-parameter approach because it is not the town code. Yet we all know how difficult some wetlands are to define, and so having more information rather than a narrower definition is how the federal and eventually New York State programs chose to resolve tough cases. It's my opinion that Mr. Shea has tried several approaches to tie down his belief that this is a wetland. But groundwater is 10 to 12 feet below grade, and the soils show no evidence of saturation or any kind of long-term moisture condition that it would give wetland plants the competitive advantage that they require to dominate. Red maple do occur in wetlands, but they also occur living just as well outside of wetlands. The town flagging relied on the single species, and I think that species has been introduced over decades of various clearing and other activities. I looked at historic aerial photos, and I see that the property has had some dirt road beds through it, maybe some farming. And while wetland definitions are a challenge when you think back over the history of a property, the technical character of wetlands is a habitat where the subsoils are in an anaerobic condition. That's no oxygen and an acidic pH. And that's what gives true wetland plants a competitive advantage over other species. And we don't have those conditions at this site. The town code itself reflects a definition based on habitat or plant community. A single species does not make a habitat community. In the town's initial report, the community invoked was red maple swamp. Well, even the source of that definition has changed their approach because of the controversy it generated. And White's Lane is sloped at an elevation well above groundwater and doesn't even look like a swamp. This particular community definition from the Reschke volume caused confusion. And the new edition, edited by Greg Ettinger, clears that up by adding the term basin. I spent quite a bit of time at the site collecting my own soils and plant data. It was a wet spring last year, and I never found saturated soils or conditions that would lead to the anaerobic situation in which wetland plants dominate. Even after a rain, while some of the soils may have felt moist at the surface, that saturated condition never developed. And even moisture from fresh rain is too short-lived to create those conditions. I took some tree cores from 2 red maples. One was about a normal-looking red maple, was about 50 years old. And another red maple, which looks remarkably similar to an individual that Marty Shea identified, which has subsequently fallen over and died. That was 25 years old. So we've got a disturbance history just on tree age, and again, an unstable environment like this is not a swamp. Swamps are stable environments. They stay wet over many decades, and that's not happened here. So when I looked also at the plants on their own, they're primarily facultative species. The federal method requires that there be some obligate species. In other words, that you find some plants that must be in wetlands. And we don't find that at this site. So the absence of plants that are obliged to live in wet conditions, their absence is a red flag to me, telling me that this site does not contain a red maple swamp. The history and surrounding woodlands are clearly indicative of a maritime successional woodland, a very common habitat type on Long Island South Fork. And that's my opinion, and I'd be pleased to answer questions.
Thank you. I have no questions right now. Want to hear from our staff, but I can assure you there will be questions later.
We have other,
Oh, sorry.
in addition to
Okay.
Dr. Abrams, I think.
Okay.
Daphne, well, not Daphne Horn, I'm sorry. Going way back. Would like to say a few words.
Daphne Vaughn, Surfside Environmental Planning. Karina is handing out some new photos that I just took on February 27th of the property. Excuse me. So about a year ago, Mr. Horning hired me to take a look at the property for the indication of wetlands. As many of you are well aware, I am a former town employee who has almost 22 years of experience delineating wetlands, and I've spent quite a bit of time crawling around a lot of the wetlands in this area throughout the past 22 years. And I do have a lot of familiarity with this particular property, as well as the surrounding lots, as I was involved with the development of the lot behind this property back in the early 2000s. So I have seen the changes to the site over the years. So over the course of the past year, I've conducted multiple site visits throughout all of the seasons and different weather conditions to monitor the site conditions and take photos, which I compiled, that Rob Marcinsic has made as part of the exhibits in your package there. So they're from February 10th of last year, May 13th, October 6th, and the recent ones that I just submitted now from February 27th of this year. In between those time frames, I did also do additional site visits where I didn't necessarily take photos, and I also did some pop-in visits here and there just to see if there was any significant changes to the site. During the most recent site visit, I can note that there was the presence of
some more prevalent fallen trees and dead red maples, specifically right along, White's Lane, that seem to have cracked at the base. There's pictures in there on photos number 5 through 7 that this tree was actually delineated as part of the 2021 flagging. You can see in the photo that the tree looks extremely dry and the roots look really dry. It was fallen in the middle of the road and during one of the recent windstorms, and the highway department had been called to come and remove it. So I wanted to make that part of the record in photographs for the board. But it showed evidence of dry soils and roots, but it was flagged as part of the wetland boundary. Another item that I thought was noteworthy was the presence of a bunch of young American holly throughout the site, which is a facultative upland species, primarily growing, as part of the understory. And there's all different sizes of American holly growing. That there's some newer ones that I noted in my recent site visit. But there really is a very sparse understory, particularly in the middle of the property, which was delineated as wetlands. Lastly, what I wanted to note from my most recent site visit is that there's a young stand of Ailanthus altissima, which is also known as the tree of heaven, which is a non-native invasive species that seems to be taking root in the front of the property along White's Lane. And it's locally known to grow basically in poor soils that are typically dry. It's very drought tolerant, and it's also known, to aid in the spread of the spotted lanternfly, which is a New York State DEC recognized invasive insect to state agricultural and forests that's invasive to them. Ailanthus is also characterized as an early successional species, further noting the hydrological changes that have taken place at the site during the course of the past 2 decades. During all of my site visits and drive-bys, I have never noted any seasonal or permanent flooding or any evidence of waterlogged soils on the site that would support the town's 2021 wetland delineation on the property. I comparatively visited 19 White's Lane at each time I visited the site, which is a known wetland that was purchased by the town. And I did take photos of that and included them in most of my site photo packages. In most of my visits, there was actually in all of my visits, there was seasonal flooding and waterlogged soil evidence or actual water at the site at 19 White's Lane. Most recently, there is skunk cabbage emerging at that property, which is evident in my recent photos and is shown in full bloom in my May photos from last year, which is an obligate wetland species. So as Rob noted earlier, the contributing factors that I believe for the removal, let's say, of wetlands from the site, from a 50% reduction in Marty's wetland flagging between 2001 and at present, because that's what actually occurred on paper from Marty's delineations in 01 and 2021 to our believed 0, is the installation of the development at 42 White's Lane, which also includes the driveway, which is pervious. However, it's an elevation of a driveway from White's Lane back to the flag lot there. So that changed probably part of the hydrology going through. But more importantly, I would say, is the 2009 to 2010 installation of that significant drainage work that's done on White's Lane. White's Lane, actually where it curves there, is significantly elevated higher along that curve, and then it goes much lower right in front of the property, that without that drainage, the water would basically come right into the property during storm events. So once that drainage was installed, you alleviated that problem significantly. And that's basically my story.
Thank you, Daphne. Someone else?
We have, one more person, Sean Barron, who would like to speak as well.
Good evening. Long time no see. Sean Barron, 124 Pleasure Drive in Flanders, although you guys aren't the ZBA, I don't have to give you my address to swear in, do I? Here for the applicant for 48 White's Lane. I don't want to really belabor the point. Basically, I'm also of the opinion that there's no wetlands here, based on the lack of a predominance of wetland indicator species, a lack of wetland hydrology, and more importantly, the absence of hydric soils. I haven't been before you guys in a long time or put any wetland permits in, basically because I've dedicated my life. I mostly do field work these days, flagging wetlands and digging test holes and things like that. I have done a couple of test hole borings here, and also installed a groundwater monitoring well. In November 12th of this year, 2022, groundwater was more than 16 feet below grade. Adjacent to the wetland area, I sunk another hole in January 2022, last year, more in the wetland area. That one had groundwater at 11 feet below grade. I went there today, groundwater is 11.3 feet below grade. I do implore you guys to please take a visit to the property. That you'll see the well there. It's just a white PVC pipe. Drop the tape measure down there, see where the groundwater is. You can't really have a wetland without water. Article 24 of the DEC defines hydric soils a few ways, but one of the requirements is to have groundwater usually within 2 feet of the surface of the soil for at least 2 weeks during the growing season. They say during the growing season because usually in the winter the water table can be a little bit higher, plants aren't transpiring, precipitation, that sort of thing. So this is the wet time of the year, and even now in the middle of the wet time of the year, groundwater is some 11 feet below grade, and you can't have a wetland without water near the surface, and that's not here. Dr. Abrams' report is more than sufficient. I had submitted a letter too, but again, I don't need to belabor the point and carry this on any further. If you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I believe that will conclude, at least for tonight, our presentation.
Thank you, Rob.
Good evening, I'm Marty Shea, Chief Environmental Analyst for the town. I've been with the town for 33 years doing wetlands work. Prior to that, I was with the DEC, overseeing the freshwater wetlands division for such office. So I also have much experience in wetland determination and delineation. First, I would turn your attention to the survey that was submitted by the applicant. That should be in front of you. That has a receipt date of December 15, 2022, and that's important because you can see the extent of the property that I had flagged as wetlands. The wetlands as delineated by me are reserved to the center of the property. Many of the comments that were made on part of the applicant's agents were generalized with regards to vegetation and conditions across the site, and in many respects were pertinent to areas outside of my wetland boundaries. As was mentioned by the applicant's counsel, there are two reports on file that I prepared. First one is dated September 29, 2022. That was a response to their initial submittal, whereas alluded by the applicant, they provided a characterization of the history of the area and the various activities that may have affected any historically occurring wetlands. They spoke to drainage issues. After that report was issued, they made a second major submittal, which focused on what they believe is the absence of regulated wetlands on this property. So the more pertinent report is the second report that you have on file, and that's dated January 17th, 2023. I also have additional testimony and exhibits to offer into the record today. Rather than go through the entirety of that second report, which is the more pertinent report, I can provide a summation of the highlights of that report. Now, understand that the main intent of that report was to respond directly to the applicant's submittal. So essentially what the report does is it provides a characterization of the site, but then it goes through all of the areas, the various areas of discussion that are raised by Dr. Ron Abrams, and responds to those matters. As was touched upon by the applicant on the first page of the January 17th report, I do make mention of what I believe was a precedent that was set by this board with regards to the presence of wetlands on this property in their May 22nd, 2019 Conservation Board decision. As the applicant had mentioned, you had received an application for the abutting lot at 49 White Oak Lane. My office had deemed a portion of that property to be wetlands. The applicant had hired a wetland scientist, Will Bowman, to review the town's determination. And in refuting the town's determination, he did indicate at the same time that there were wetlands on the subject property, which is 48 White's Lane, and showed a boundary within a portion of this property. And my recollection was that was a boundary that he had marked rather than my office. And that boundary, which was far from complete, and was delineated way outside of the boundaries that I have drawn, was used for the purposes of issuing a wetlands permit for development of the adjacent lot, and also for the purposes of establishing a covenanted, naturally vegetated buffer, which extended into from the subject property extended into the abutting lot. The applicant has since restored that area to native vegetation, recorded the necessary covenants. In addition to that history, there is some history in terms of other abutting lots. The flag lot that was mentioned, wherein a fenced driveway runs along the east side of the subject property. The interior of that lot has a small area of freshwater wetlands, which has, the wetlands have decreased in size over time, and as a condition of a wetlands permit that was issued for that lot recently, those wetlands were covenanted as a preservation area and a naturally vegetated buffer was established. Then we also have the property on the east side of that bisecting flag lot drive that also has a history of conservation board and administrative wetland permits due to the presence of wetlands. So aside from the issue of this board deciding whether or not there are regulated wetlands on this property, there are neighboring wetlands which on the basis of the presence of those neighboring wetlands, portions of this property would be within 200 feet of wetlands. So even in the event that the board reached a determination that there were no regulated wetlands on this property, the applicant would still have to file for a conservation board wetlands permit in order to develop this property because of the proximity of other freshwater wetlands outside of the parcel boundaries. As this board knows, the Town Wetland Law, Chapter 325, uses vegetation as an indicator of the presence or absence of wetlands, and it's the primary determinant for the purposes of delineating wetland boundaries. Did you want me to stop for a moment?
Yes.
Because we don't have a quorum. Okay.
Yes. Realized.
Yeah, we're close to the wire here at a quorum. We need everybody we have. So why don't we take this opportunity to take a 5-minute break so everybody can stretch and get a drink of water or whatever they need to do, and then we'll come back and continue. And Kevin, I know that throws a monkey wrench in what you're doing, but we'll be back as soon as we can. Figure about 5 minutes.
Hey, Kevin, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, Ron. Or,
Zeb.
Yeah, the video doesn't look good. I can't see everybody. Is that something on my end?
I think so, yeah.
All right. I'm doing it through my phone, not at my desk, so I can't get the full effect. I only get the middle three. I can't see Sean. Can't see Marty.
Okay.
Cameras cover 360?
There,
Okay.
there.
Okay. That way might
That's-
not
you guys are
pick
that.
up, we'll pick up over there.
You guys are on that one.
Yeah, but that one probably doesn't pick up the back of the room as much, I guess. It's
yeah.
aimed this way.
I can move that wherever I want to move it.
Yeah, okay. Sean, you want him to be able to see you?
How's everybody said hello?
Zebby says hello.
Hey, I can hear him, Sean. Sean, yeah.
This is quite the reunion tonight.
Yeah, it is.
Sean, Daphne, Rob, Martha, Matt.
Matt, yeah. What?
Quite a ragtag fugitive fleet we have going on.
Yeah.
Your moms came to visit.
It started for me in 1998.
How's the new dog?
Pardon me?
You got your dog, right?
New puppy.
Okay.
Twice the size of when I got him originally, because he was a little undersized, but I'm letting him eat anything he wants. So he's good. He's developing his own little personality.
I think we're still on Zoom, just so you
Okay.
know.
And so, even though I'm not increasing the number of hotel rooms, we're actually reducing the number of hotel rooms, but making each hotel room a little bit bigger. Two of them are vacancy with that intensification. It's not an additional bed. We were talking like what, how many extras are and then so they're saying that has to go, so I get it, because if you look good to see one before you see it's the intent, you want to do anything to it, just to like get through the door and move in.
Everything's an increase of the non-conforming use, like you said.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is right.
But, so I'm like, well, this has been an inn since the 1780s, so. But what we're doing is, we're making things really accessible. We also want to put in a pool, and what I've had to explain to the board is, so there are transitional yards when you butt in your commercial use in a residential neighborhood. So we've designed the pool to meet the 50-foot transition yard. And, well, I mean, it's needs a variance because it's going to fix our parking lot because they're commercial use. So we can wildly go for coverage. It's just residential use then, they need the coverage variance. And our pool, with 40 feet, is that bad? And you need to get it because we put some vegetative, like, buffer. Right? And we're covenanting that the hourly operation, including the factory, covers the need from the pool.
I forgot about that.
I have to remember, there's only 4 to make sure.
Okay, we're back and we're running and Marty, we're all ears.
Oh, God, we got detention.
Okay, Marty Shea, Chief Environmental Analyst for the town, here to continue my testimony. Just to recap a point that I had made before you break. Notwithstanding what this board's final determination is, in this case with regards to the absence or presence of regulated wetlands on the subject property, I have aerial photographs wherein I can point to where there are neighboring wetlands, which would put the subject property within 200 feet of those wetlands as well. So on those aerial photographs, what you're seeing is the flag lot that I spoke of, whose drive runs along the easterly boundary of the subject property. There are wooded freshwater wetlands on the opposite side of that drive. If you follow that drive south, where it curves more to the southwest, you see kind of a dark circular area on the opposite side of the drive. That's a secondary area of freshwater wetlands. And you'll see that the setbacks from that area are shown on the applicant's survey or site plan, but not the setbacks from the wetlands on the opposite side of the drive. The applicant had Dr. Ron Abrams had correctly noted that the principal determinant of the presence or absence of wetlands as per the town code is vegetation. And then it indicated that, you know, other agencies have since varied their determinants and methodology to include soils and water. And so whereas with the exception of Phragmites dominated areas, and this is a wooded area, hydrology is not a qualifier as per the wetland law. The Ron Abrams in his report and tonight had touched upon some of the other features that he had looked at. So I did respond to his report's discussion of those items. He indicated in his report and in his testimony tonight that the soils that occur on the site were not wetland soils. So one of the guiding documents that I looked at was the soil survey of Suffolk County, New York, which was prepared by the USDA Soil Conservation Service, which has since become the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And that extensive soil survey of the county had mapped the on-site soils as berry land, mucky sand with. Now in saying this, I'm focusing primarily on the area that I flagged as wetlands. It had mapped that area as berry land, mucky sand, a very minor amount of Sudbury sandy loam. And had gone on to say that the mapped berry land soils are very poorly drained, coarse textured wet soils where high water tables pose severe limitations for home sites and sewage disposal field. The soil survey went on to say that the soils which were mapped as being present on the subject property are best suited for red maple woodlands and wetland wildlife habitat. So I'll just offer an exhibit related to that. One is a copy of the page of the Suffolk County soil survey that covers the subject property. And the second one is the town GIS system had digitized the soil map and overlaid it on a composite tax map of the town. So what you're seeing is an overlay of where those county map soils, the very lumpy soils occur on this property. And again, it takes in the major part of the central portion of this property that I had delineated as wetlands. Just to give you a characterization of the project site, and again, I'm going to focus on the area within the bounds of what I flagged as wetlands. The area is dominated by mature red maples. And this is standard red maples that has been on the site for many, many years. And I can say that based upon historical aerials that I printed out, which at the very least, although you can use those aerials to say that the trees are red maples, what you do see is that the property had a mature forested cover going back for quite a few years. So I'm offering into the record a 1976 aerial photograph and a more recent 2001 aerial photograph. And I'm offering up these exhibits just to provide some clarity in terms of the long-term nature of this site as a wooded sites. Dr. Abrams had indicated that he took cores of 2 of the trees and had contended that some of the trees were 25, that the trees were 25 to 50 years of age. But he in no way said that he did an exhaustive coring of the trees. So just to give you a better characterization of the site. So again, the site is dominated by red maples. Now, one of the things that I'm going to do here is I'm going to reference parts of chapter 325. And that's important not only with regards to providing guidance on how to determine whether or not they're regulated wetlands, but it also references some documents, and it does reference ecological communities in New York State, but the manual that is referenced is the March 1990 manual. So in looking at the state described ecological community types and their description of red maple swamps, I had to focus on the 1990 report because that's the one that's specifically referenced by chapter 325. So just to further characterize the site conditions is so you have fairly mature red maples that are dominant within the bounds of the wetland boundaries I flagged. Big, spreading, heavy canopies, creating a lot of shade. The ground covering vegetation is somewhat sparse, and there is a mix of both wetland indicator species and upland indicator species. The wetland indicator species, which I found on the site, were Ilex verticillata, which is fact wet plus, swamp dewberry, which is fact wet, Nyssa sylvatica, which is fact wet, Lindera benzoin, which is fact wet minus, and Viburnum recognitum, which is fact wet minus. Also appearing was the Ilex opaca, which is the holly, which was touched upon by one of the agents. There's Smilex rotundifolia, which is greenbrier, which is FAC, holly being FAC upland plus. And then there's invasives. And my report provides a list of those scattered invasives that also appear that are indicative of upland conditions rather than wetland conditions. One of the reasons that you have invasive species within the bounds of the wetland line that I flagged is you have a lot of edge around this property. You've got the road, you've got the driveway coming in, you have a lot of disturbance. And what that in combination with seed dispersal tends to do is it brings in early colonizers, early successional species. Many of the upland species are early colonizers. And if the weather conditions are dry for long periods of time, it is particularly advantageous for these successional species to occur. But that's one of the reasons why the town code uses vegetation as an indicator of the presence of wetlands, because vegetation, particularly mature vegetation, mature shrubs, mature trees, will give you a sense of what the conditions the property have been like for long periods of time. So one of the reasons I mention this is because one of the things that I've been following over the years is NOAA's federal drought monitor, which is updated at least every few months. And what it does is it maps out areas of the country where there are droughty conditions at present. The most recent drought monitor maps that were released by by NOAA, one is dated January 3rd, 2023, and you'll see that it shows moderate drought conditions in the area of the subject property. And the second one that was released February 28th shows abnormally dry conditions on eastern Long Island. In addition to these recent drought monitor reports, if you look at NOAA's history of monitoring, you can see there was a very long period of drought conditions on the east end, lasting at least a decade. Now, when you have persistent drought conditions, even if you start getting additional rains, it takes a long time for those groundwater levels to elevate and come back to normal. So while the applicant had dug test holes that showed a significant depth at present of groundwater, while those test holes are reflective of what the conditions are here and today, they are not necessarily reflective of the groundwater conditions historically on this property, or in the event that precipitation conditions return to normal and the groundwater slowly elevates again, what the future water levels will look like. The other thing that the drought does is during these long drought periods, even if you have long-standing wetland trees and long-standing mature wetland shrubs, those drought conditions make the soils more advantageous for colonization by invasive, non-native, upland favoring plants. Some of those are garlic mustard, Japanese stiltgrass, privet, barberry, Japanese honeysuckle, which again, as previously indicated, are scattered across the property. One of the things that's very evident when you look at this site is that the dominant biomass at this site is red maple. When you look at a piece of property in order to assess the dominance of vegetation types, the way it's done in the case of trees is you're not just looking at the square footage area that's covered by the trunk. You have to look at the canopy of that tree and how much of the land in question that covers. So, as indicated, this is the area that I flagged as wetlands is a red maple dominant area. The other tree species that have been mentioned in various reports and were touched upon tonight, those species are all occurring outside of my wetland boundaries. So the aged trees are all red maples. So in the case of red maple, what the code says is it says where a site is dominated by facultative species, which are characteristic of Long Island's wetlands, such as red maple and black tupelo, and there are some black tupelos. It favors a community approach in determining the wetland boundary. Now, if there were just red maples and there was no evidence of any wetland shrubs in the understory at all, you might look at this area a little bit differently, but as indicated, there are scattered facultative wetland shrubs in the understory. And if you look at their coverage in combination with the coverage of the red maples, clearly the wetland indicative vegetation is dominant within the bounds of the wetland boundary. So, so let's turn to the code again. What it says is the test of wet constitutes a wetland community, and this is where you have a lot of red maples. It says, will be satisfied if the species of those included in the description of natural wetland community.
Would you quote the chapter, the part of the code you're referring to?
Yeah, section 325-2. That should be boundary of a wetland, the definition. And what it says is where you have a site that's dominated by, you have an area that's dominated by red maple or black tupelo, you need to take more of a community approach. And in doing so, it references the New York Natural Heritage Program manual entitled Ecological Communities in New York State, dated March 1990. And when you look at that, and I can, first I'll hand up the section I just read for the benefit of other board members. And that's a definition of boundary of a wetland where it talks about this stuff. So here I have the copy of the ecological community type description for red maple swamp. And this is in the 1990 manual. And what it says, the hardwood swamp that occurs in poorly drained depressions, usually on inorganic soils. This is a broadly defined community with many regional and edaphic variants. Edaphic means soil. So it acknowledges that there's a lot of variability in the soils that occur in this community type. And then it describes red maple swamps, upstate and in the larger state, and then also talks about where's the word? It talks about how there's variability in southeastern New York. And what you'll note, what jumps out at you when you look at this, is number one, it can say that red maple can be the only canopy dominant in this wetland type, or it can be co-dominant with other hardwoods. And in southeastern New York, it says black tupelo. And black tupelo, there are also black tupelos in the area that I flagged. And then it lists as some of the characteristic shrubs, spice bush, which I found on the site, winterberry, which I also found, arrowwood, and then again, black gum. Yes, it has a very lengthy list of many characteristic species, and of course the site is not supporting all those species, but it is also supporting some of those species that are identified as occurring in the understory layer in the red maple hardwood swamp ecological community type description. So what are some of the other things that you look for when you go to a site like this? And among other indicators, soil wetness over long periods of time. You would look at whether or not there's any evidence of buttressed tree roots. And what buttressed tree roots is essentially what occurs with the tree is it grows above the ground with its roots raised partially above the ground. And it's doing that to elevate the tree above soils that are low in oxygen, that tend to be compacted, that are oftentimes wet. And there are examples of buttressed red maple tree roots at the site. I only took a photo of one that I attached to our report, and unfortunately, as was mentioned, that tree was recently cut down. But you will see the actual photo that I took of that tree when it was standing. So that's another thing you look for in forested wetlands, whether or not there's any evidence of buttressed tree roots. There are some other factors that come into play as well when you're looking at vegetation. The degree of shade can be a factor as far as the diversity of the ground layer and understory. This is a heavily shaded site because of the age and the spreading canopies of the red maples. I had mentioned because it is fragmented by development, you have a lot of edge, which oftentimes introduces edge species, typically invasive species. You have to acknowledge that many of the forests on eastern Long Island, including this area, are also impacted by deer browse. So these are all factors that play a role in whether or not you have a very diverse and thick understory. What's going on as far as long-term weather conditions, whether or not you have droughty conditions, whether or not you have edge. One of the things that the edge also does, and this is the reason why this is mentioned in the description of the need for buffer zones. Those areas are exposed to the wind. You tend to have windfall, wind throw of trees, as has occurred with 2 trees. And then you have to recognize that deer browse can have a big impact on the diversity and extent of understory as well. So, let's see. Now, one of the things that Dr. Abrams mentions in his report, and he also alluded to it tonight, is that the 1990 Ecological Communities of New York State, in recognizing the variability in red maple swamp communities, did revise that manual. And one of the things that I think he touched upon is that they added some additional language. Some of that language was whether or not the vegetative community is occurring in poorly drained depressions or basins. And it also added that more data is yet needed on variants of this community type. And with regards to the elevations and topography, if you look at the copy of this report in the Conservation Board file, you're going to see that a topography map was included. And what it shows is the area that I flagged as wetlands is below the 25-foot contour. And if you follow that 25-foot contour, the lowlands below that elevation take in a big regional expanse. And it's in that expanse, and this is a contiguous area, it's in that expanse to the north of White Flame that you have very extensive freshwater wetlands. So it's at a similar topography and elevation to many of the freshwater wetland areas to the north. Well, what you should see is a map that shows that overlaid topographical contours. It's in the file and should be attached to your report. The applicant also, Dr. Abrams also indicated in his submittal, and he kind of alluded to it tonight in his testimony, that he would characterize the woodlands at the site as a successional maritime forest. But if you look at the definition of that ecological community type in the 1990 manual, the qualifiers are very different from what we have here. It says that number one, this is a site that is far removed from the seacoast. But what the description of the ecological community type says that one of the characteristic conditions is that you see stunted, flat-topped, pruned, or trees that were unduly influenced by salt spray. Those are kind of considered defining characteristics of the successional maritime forest ecological community type. So notwithstanding Dr. Abrams' disagreement that this area should be included as one of the variants of red maple swamp types, I don't see that it meets his classification of this area as a successional maritime forest. One of the things that's often mentioned about red maples is, I heard someone say tonight, oh, they're invasive, or oh, they're very common and they occur everywhere. Well, yeah, red maples can be planted in your backyard and they'll thrive without those conditions being very wet. And the reason why red maples are the dominant tree in Long Island's wooded wetlands, whether they be more flooded swamp conditions or wet deciduous woods, is not because they need the water in order to grow in those areas. It's because they can tolerate the stressful growing conditions. And that's one of the reasons they used as street trees. Red maples can tolerate the low, the oxygen deprivation that you often have in wetland areas, the compaction of soils, the variability in water. They're able to better tolerate those conditions than other trees. And that's why when you see them thriving in an area, it's an indicator that there's something different here. And that wetness, among other things, when you look at the long term of that forest area, is certainly a factor. The applicant had also indicated in their report that the standard red maples was born as a consequence of area seed availability and proximate dissemination, not related to site conditions. Well, I indicated in my report that conjecture really runs counter to basic biology regarding seed rain and requirements for suitable microsites for germination and establishment of new plants. If you look at any area of soil out here, there are literally thousands of seeds that are raining down in that area from all different species, upland species and wetland species. And in a wetland area during drought conditions, some of those upland species may begin to grow and they may thrive for a while until the drought conditions drastically change and the groundwater levels return to normal. So that's the reason why you want to look at the age of the vegetation as well, because the age of the vegetation tells you what the conditions are like for very long periods of time. And in the case of the red maple and black tupelo and the wetland indicator shrubs, they're in a higher age group than most of the other invasive vegetation that you see within the area that I define as wetlands. So if you look at the definition of wetlands and of a boundary of wetlands in chapter 25, and you look at this side, the first thing that catches your eye is the dominant old red maples, which virtually all the forested wetlands on Long Island are dominated by red maples. That's one of the first things that you notice, which is an indicator of different conditions as opposed to upland forest. Because if you go in this area, White's Lane and White Oak Lane is a very forested area. And once you get out of the wetlands, you see a lot of oaks. You don't see that concentration of all maples. There are some maples scattered with the oaks, but you don't see them dominating a land area like you see within the bounds of the area I flagged. So what the code directs you, and Dr. Abrams acknowledged this as well, that some sites can be challenging because there are a lot of factors involved in terms of that give rise to ecological community types and changes in those types, many of those which I mentioned tonight. But so the first thing is, again, you see a dominance of them. There's clearly a dominance of red maples on this side. They're clearly the dominant vegetative biomass. And so what else do you look at? You look at the understory. And the understory, it's really a scattering of different plants, but you do see some of those wetland indicator shrubs that are identified in chapter 325, that are identified in ecological communities of New York State as being indicative of wetlands. And if you take those scattered shrubs together with that overwhelming biomass, red maple, despite any changes that may be occurring over the long term, at present you're still seeing a dominance of wetland vegetation within the boundaries that I flagged. Have some of these activities that occurred in the area affected this area? Absolutely. White's Lane used to be very flooded in that area, and then in violation of DEC wetland laws, a former highway department started doing construction in the area, started elevating the road, and installing drainage. And if you look in those drainage catch basins, every time I've gone out there, they're like almost full of water to within a foot or two of the ground surface. And has that construction affected the biology of this property? Absolutely. Has the construction of the adjacent driveway affected that?
absolutely. Has the clearing of woodlands in adjacent areas affected? Yeah, what that allows is for greater drying to get, to occur further into this remaining stand of wetlands. And then, like I said, we're still operating under drought conditions. So that certainly is a factor. And then, this is an area that gets heavily, where the understory is heavily browsed from deer. So notwithstanding those other factors, I think on vegetation alone, you have to, at this time, reach the decision that there's a dominance of wetland indicative vegetation right now, and that the area has to be defined and regulated as wetlands. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Did you want to speak?
Yes, please. Hi, good evening. David Kirst from Matthews, Kirst & Cooley, East Hampton, 241 Pantago Road. We represent 49 White Oak LLC. Its principals John and Bill Wines, the owners of 49 White Oak Lane, who unfortunately cannot be here this evening, so you are stuck with me. As the property address, prior determinations have all been thrown around in submissions here at the podium, including Dr. Will Bowman, who was the expert for our applicant during their hearings here. And I just want to start by referring to Dr. Bowman. We did provide the materials to him that the applicant had previously submitted, and consistent with his determination during our application and consistent with Mr. Shea's determination is that he believes there is wetlands on the applicant's property. He disagrees with the methodology that the applicant's advisors are following, and unfortunately we couldn't get anything for this evening, but we will be submitting a written submission from Dr. Bowman if the board so permits, so stating that he feels that the conclusion drawn by the applicant is incorrect, that Mr. Shea is correct, that Dr. Bowman's prior conclusions that there are wetlands on this property are correct. Next, I'd just like to address, it seems that a significant part of the applicant's challenge here is not to, in addition to challenging Mr. Shea's determination, is a challenge to the code, which unfortunately is not up to this board. If the applicant wants a change to the definition of wetlands, change to the methodology referred to in the code, that's a matter for the town board to do, not a matter for this board to go outside of the plain meaning and plain language of the code as it currently stands. We also heard comments regarding the separation to groundwater of, ranging for, depending on which member of the applicant's team was speaking, somewhere between 11 to 16 feet below grade, which appears to be from the location where the test hole was done at one of the higher elevations on the property. The 2022 test hole done by the applicant showed that the low point, the water was found at an elevation of 13.5 feet. The low point on this property is 18 feet. So that would leave only 4.5 feet of separation between grade and groundwater on the property, not the 16 feet claimed by the applicant.
And where is that location?
It's on the survey. It's I believe, just south of the wetlands flagged by Mr. Shea. It's right in this area here, 18 feet. There's a clear 18-foot contour.
Would that be the Drew Soil Pit S4?
Yes. I would say the test hole information, the test hole is up here on the, right by the street. So that low point over here is of 18 feet, would only be 4.5 feet from the water that was found in the test hole that was done along the roadway.
But was water found in that particular test hole?
I don't know, I don't have that information.
That would be the relevant measure. Otherwise, you're doing an extrapolation, which is somewhat meaningless.
Right, no, that is all I have, so.
All right, thank you.
Again, we'd like, if the board isn't leaving the record open, we'd like the record left open so that we can have a submission from Dr. Bowman.
Our plan is to leave it open.
Okay, thank you very much.
Rob, are you finished with your people to testify?
I think so. Perhaps Dr. Abrams has something
That's his hand up again?
respond.
Dr. Abrams, would you like to speak again?
Yeah, I have a couple of comments, I'll be quick. I'm not sure my message was clear enough. Mr. Shea, in using the fact designation, is invoking part of the federal method. The fact designations were created as part of the three-parameter approach. So it's cherry picking to use that and then dismiss soils and hydrology. And as this prior speaker was saying, it's not that we're trying to change the definition in the town code. We're trying to refine the science used to get to a correct answer. Ironically, the prior speaker pointed to the 18-foot elevation, which is, he says, is within 4 feet of groundwater, and that's not even in Marty Shea's delineation. That's the lower corner of the property. It does look like it might be wetter than the rest of the property, but he didn't include it. And to invoke the drought concept and imply that if we wait long enough, like hundreds of years, the groundwater is going to rise 10 feet, it's just not practical or realistic. Protecting a piece of property because you think in geological time frames it's going to change its hydrology, that just makes no sense. That's stretching to make everything fit his preconceived notion that this is part of a red maple swamp. I'm a little disappointed. He talked again and again about the 1990 version of the Natural Heritage book. They revised the definition of red maple swamp because people have been misusing it for years. And now it must be considered as part of a basin. Furthermore, if you walk across White's Lane into the wetland area north, to which he's trying to link the 25-foot contour, you do not find an understory that's sparse. A true red maple swamp is so dense, you need boots up to your hips to walk through it because you've got tussock sedge, you've got skunk cabbage, you've got all kinds of other plants. And they live under the shade. So the invoking of shade is a spurious attempt to fool us. This is not a red maple swamp. I don't care how you twist it and turn it. Yeah, there are variants of red maple swamps, but they're all low areas and their ground cover is dense. So those are my comments. That's all I have.
Well, thank you. Is there anyone, did you want to?
Yeah, I think we're done. As before us this evening. I assume that you're going to put this case over, so.
Yes,
You know,
that's where I'm trying to go.
we'll reserve our right to respond to
Thank
anybody's
you.
comment.
There'll be plenty of time, just not tonight.
Yep. Understood.
Is there anyone else in the public who would like to speak in this application? Let me just try to pull everything together of an hour and a half testimony. I'm gonna try to do that in about 45 seconds. We heard significant testimony. We also are in receipt of significant written testimony. All of it carries the same weight. And that testimony is both from staff and from the applicant and the applicant's people. There is a huge amount of information here, and it's going to require some digesting on the board's part and some thinking up the appropriate questions to arrive at the answer that we believe is appropriate and consistent with Chapter 325. We also would like an opportunity to visit the property, at least for some of the board members. Some have visited, but more want to visit. Do we need to contact you before we visit, or can we just stop in?
Please go.
Thank you. So we will need to adjourn this to a later date. There's really nothing that we're asking you to do for that next meeting. You've given us plenty of information. And we may have questions when we come back again. We probably will have questions. And we'd like to tie things together and wrap it up then. When shall we adjourn this to? We are busy until April.
May 10th.
April, May 10th, would that work?
That's weird.
Thank you. Is there a motion?
May
Motion to adjourn till May 10th?
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. We'll see you on May 10th.
Very good.
Is everyone keeping?
I'm gonna keep it, yeah, we'll keep it.
I want to keep this one. Yes.
Affidavit to the file.
And the next application is A022056, Alexandra C. Fraden and John A. Raphael as trustees of the Alexandra C. Fraden Family Trust. And others involving 50% interest and as tenants in common.
This is a new hearing. We do have affidavits of posting and mailing, so the board does have jurisdiction to open the hearing.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Martha Reichert from the law firm of Tumiche, Kelly, Dubin, and Quartararo. I'm here to represent the applicant, which is the Fraden Family Trust. This is a little bit of an unusual application because it involves a 5-foot pedestrian easement to access the waters of Sand Creek. And so initially this was an administrative permit, but this application comes with a long history of litigation. Our clients purchased the property, they sought to clear it in 2013, and the easement runs along the center of a common boundary between 39 and 47 Sand Creek Road. And so in 2013, my client originally sought to clear the easement to maintain it as the pedestrian pathway to the water, and litigation ensued amongst the neighbors. It went all the way up to the appellate division, and the appellate division upheld the right that the easement was valid, but also maintained that it was wrong for the Supreme Court to have enjoined the clearing of the easement. In other words, my client has a right to use her easement for its intended purpose, which is access to Sands Creek. As a solution, because we knew that the neighbors were unwilling to sign the owner's endorsement pages of the town's application, the town attorney's office recommended that we instead process this application as a conservation board application so that it could go to a public hearing to afford the neighbors sufficient notice and an opportunity to comment. And so that's why we're here today, is to, now that my client has her hard-fought and well-deserved victory in the court that her easement is valid, to begin using it and maintaining it so that it does not fall back into a state of overgrowth and disrepair. The easement itself, as I stated before, is 5 feet wide. Each neighbor maintains some form of fencing, marking out the boundaries of the easement for a majority of it. And we seek to clear and install a 4 foot wide pervious path.
Those neighbors' fences, do they encroach on the easement?
From our last survey, they do not appear to encroach into the easement. They're very close on the border, but we have not had any sort of objections about the fences, and I believe that in both properties' most recent surveys, especially the property to the north, they recently received a certificate of wetlands compliance for their major house project, and the easement appears to be, I mean, the fence line appears to be on the easement line, so it's non-encroaching.
We are in receipt of the court's determinations, both court's determinations. And we believe that currently, I guess, finally, the appellate court is final.
Yeah. It was not appealed to any higher court, so the decision is binding.
Would you describe a little more clearly the nature of the clearing that your applicant wishes to do?
Sure. Well, so, I mean, the photographs that I just distributed along with the plan that was provided by and drawn by Suffolk Environmental. I'm joined by Matt Ivins tonight if you have any questions for him. The easement area, I've been to the property now several times, has been mostly cleared. That may have been a result of the ongoing construction project, but for the most part, it is completely passable. The plant growth that you have is occasionally some garlic mustard. You can see through some of those, there's heavy leaf droppings throughout the path. There's some bramble as you get closer to the water, but for the most part, there isn't any real heavy vegetation there in terms of, until you get to, there's like an embankment and then a slope downwards to the water where you have Phragmites.
So I see these pictures, and would it be correct then to summarize what you're saying is that the clearing that you'd like to do would be categorized as pruning, but not entering the soil itself, that is digging? So you'd be pruning the above-ground portions of plants that encroach on the easement area?
I think that's fair. I mean, I think that what you're sort of getting around is there is a red maple sort of in the middle.
Yes.
Towards
the
and
end.
so, you know, I've grappled with this because we recognize that the red maple has been there for quite some time, but we also look at the fact that the easement is to clear a 4-foot path. And just like any applicant that comes before you has a right to that 4-foot path through the water, you know, we don't have any room to sort of say, oh, we can go around it, right? Because the neighbors are hostile. This easement, there's simply no way for us to go around it. I do think that it might be worth looking at the extent that we can prune it. It's a multi-trunked red maple, so I do think that if we were able to do some pruning and perhaps take down at least one of the trunks, that could potentially provide sufficient space for someone to navigate with their kayak. You know, at this point, you probably only have 2.5 feet, so if you're carrying a kayak or a paddleboard, I think it's a practical impossibility to get down to the water with it. It's right smack dab in the middle, so.
Yeah, it looks like there may be a way to prune to something like a 6-foot height to allow for passage more comfortably. There's one branch, heavy branch, that seems to, at least if I was carrying a kayak, it would be in my way. Okay, that answers that part of the question. The other part of the question is, what is your plan for the terminus at the water, where
Sure.
there's a slope?
There is a slope, so we recognize that it will need to be improved in some manner. Whatever structure that is, though, it does fall under the jurisdiction of the trustees, of the freeholders. And so at this point, we have not made an application to the trustees because, well, we need to consult with them on several different issues in terms of what that structure will be for getting down to the water. There's no way to do it without some form of improvement. I mean, I'm a pretty adventurous soul, and it's too much of a slope for anyone to do it. You know, I read Mr. Shea's report in which he sort of suggested that we just stop and enjoy the view from the overlook. Unfortunately, that's not what our easement's for. Our easement is not to sit and enjoy the view. In fact, that would be an expansion of the easement. The easement is for pedestrian access to Sam's Creek. So if that was the intended purpose of the easement, that's what we would do, but that's not. It's to get to the waters of Sam Creek, and that's what we would like to do. So
Are
again,
you suggesting that the sloped area would be under the authority of the trustees?
well, as you know, if you look at the approvals, including I'll use the property to the north as the most recent example, because the applicant there applied to the Conservation Board for a wetlands permit for the house construction project and to the trustees concurrently to remove the pre-existing dock and install a new one further to the south. Chapter 325 very clearly states there's no concurrent jurisdiction, right? And there was no concurrent approval needed. And the certificate of wetlands compliance that was issued, I don't know, about 2 weeks ago, makes no mention of the dock and the ramp and the catwalk that the owner of the neighboring property uses. So I'm not trying to create a controversy. This is common practice throughout this board and how it interacts with the trustees, that the applicant goes to the trustees for its water-dependent structure. We're mindful of the fact that we'd like to preserve the red maple to the fullest extent possible, but we also need to talk to the trustees about, is it a similar, what I guess Jim Walker did the property to the north. He calls it like a dinghy dock, right? Where it's really you ramp up, you ramp down, and then you have a drop platform. The neighbor to the north has a floating dock, but again, not really within the purview of this board specifically in terms of what we're here to do, which is to establish that 4-foot path.
The boundary, the legal boundary that we generally adhere to is that if you want to do something landward of open water, you come to this board. But if you go to the trustees for a permit on open water that also includes some work upland, they may determine that that's their jurisdiction. And if they do make that determination, then we don't have jurisdiction. If they don't make that determination, then we have jurisdiction. So we take our lead from the trustees when there's an area near their jurisdiction.
Sure. I think that there are many, many examples where there was no need to go to the Conservation Board for jurisdiction to create a water-dependent structure for access to the water. The two closest examples are the properties to the north and the south. But, I think that if you want to take a more extreme example, I look to Island Creek Road, the Gubbins application, 40B Island Creek Road, which was a very long catwalk, right? I think it was about 300 linear feet long, and it was determined in the end that the only permit they needed was from the trustees. So that's a very extreme example, but so I'm not trying to belabor the point, but I think that, we will, and I'm sure when the trustees, an application is made to the trustees, they will refer it to this board for its comments. But what we're looking to do here is to secure and maintain that 4-foot pervious path that we're entitled to have to get to the water, which is no different from the neighboring properties to the north and the south who have their 4-foot pervious paths.
The dilemma comes in that you're applying to this board first. And until the trustees issue a permit and take jurisdiction, then that slope is under the purview of this board.
So would it be this board's preference that we table this application pending determination from the trustees?
If you want to do something on that slope and think that you're going to apply for a structure that the trustees may issue a permit for that could encompass that slope, you kind of need to.
Okay. I mean, that's something that we can certainly do. We can adjourn this hearing pending a submission to the trustees for a water-dependent structure of some kind. You know, I would like to at least get some feedback from this board in terms of there are any other comments about clearing the
Yeah,
easement?
so actually, let's
Yeah.
wait there and let's hear the staff report, and then we can pick up at the end.
All right, thank you.
Good evening, Marty Shea, Chief Environmental Analyst for the town. I did have the opportunity to walk the easement, and there are a number of issues. One, when I did the inspection, which was November 30th, 2022, there was actually a perpendicular wire fence that extended across a portion of this easement and actually blocked access. I had to climb over that fence in order to follow the rest of the easement. I don't know if that, I think it may have been installed by the abutter. Well, the property on the north side, and do we have absolute, so my first question is whether or not we have absolute confirmation as to whether or not that has been removed, because obviously to provide safe pedestrian access, that wire fence needs to be removed.
Marty, where did you see the fence?
It was,
Seaward side.
it was fairly close to the crest of the embankment. It seemed to be routed along the landward boundary of the covenanted buffer on the northerly lot, and then it extended.
Sure.
And, you know, like I said, I had to climb over it in order.
There's no fence there.
Yeah.
And the very first
Okay,
photograph
all right, good.
in your
Good.
packet shows.
Well, so someone took that fence out, fortunately. As was alluded to, the area of concern is the crest of the bluff, where we have that valued red maple. And then you have a very steep slope dropping down to the water, where you have very heavy underbrush. You have a combination of briars, you got some shrubs, you got a lot of reeds. So in order to cut that last part of the easement, you'd have to cut through considerable wetland vegetation and buffering vegetation. It wouldn't, as was alluded to, it wouldn't be safe to try and walk down that slope. You'd break your neck. So you need to build some kind of stairway or elevated catwalk. And I would absolutely agree that I don't think, what I would recommend is that the board not act on this application until the applicant has prepared a plan for the final portion of that access easement, whether it be showing the proposed clearing within those easement boundaries, showing whether or not they're going to put in steps, descending steps, and then an elevated boardwalk, and whether or not they're going to put a dock, and that application be submitted to the trustees, because we absolutely need to get a ruling from the trustees as to the extent of their jurisdiction. Because notwithstanding some of the cases that were mentioned, in recent years, there's been a little bit of back and forth on part of the trustees with regard to these access structures and cutting of vegetation, land with a mean high water for the purposes of access. You know, in light of the litigation history, I don't see any way that we can act on this application without the applicant going further, preparing a plan for how they're gonna cut that final access section, submitting that plan to the trustees, and at least getting preliminary ruling from them, indicating whether or not they have jurisdiction over the entirety of that last part of the easement, or whether or not they're gonna defer some part of that to us. Because otherwise, we're in a position where the only thing that we can permit without getting that jurisdictional determination from them is the continued pruning and shearing of encroaching vegetation along the remainder of that easement, or at least the portions of the easement that's within 200 feet from wetlands. So you probably want to look to adjourn this hearing for probably 2 months in order to provide the applicant sufficient time to go forward with an application with the trustees. Because although no one else has attended this hearing tonight, I don't know if
There may be
there's
somebody on
people
Zoom who'll ask that next.
When I did my site inspection, a neighbor had raised questions and expressed concerns about whether or not they were going to construct a dock and whether or not they were going to cut that final portion of the easement. So I think we'd all be in a better position if we knew what the plan was for that area, and if the trustees ruled on that, and then we'll be able to close the hearing and issue the appropriate wetlands permit. Thank you.
Anybody on Zoom?
Is there anyone on Zoom, Kevin, that wants to speak?
Yeah, we have one person.
Okay, they can come on now.
Hello, how are you?
Good.
Hello.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to just briefly comment. I appreciate your consideration. My name is Jerry Silk. I am the homeowner of 47 Sam's Creek on the northerly side of the so-called easement. And I just wanted to raise a few comments, if you would so permit me. First, I would like to just clarify the record. The applicant said that there was litigation in the Supreme Court amongst neighbors, plural. To my understanding, there was only one neighbor southerly border that litigated that issue. I was not involved in that litigation at all, nor do I believe any other neighbors were. And the applicant's correct that that pathway, and it is described in the deed as a pathway, not an easement. I think that's an important point to raise. Was in fact cleared and is largely cleared up until the red maple. I'm not sure, given my inspection of that area, both when Mr. Shea was there and then on other occasions, I'm not sure there's a way to address the red maple in a suitable way to allow someone to get past that. I think it's an old, actually beautiful tree there. And I'm not really sure, we could talk about a plan to prune it and all, but I'm not really sure how practical that is. I'm not an expert in this area, but it is centered in that easement area, and it's quite large. Having said that, I do believe that clearing the maple and then beyond the maple to what is a very kind of dense wetland area with a substantial amount of natural plant material would be a real, at least in my view, and I'm not an expert, a real issue, given the natural barrier that that wetland provides to the homes in that section. Importantly, I do agree with the board's preliminary view that this would be appropriate for the trustees to address in the first instance. Primarily because I think there is a little bit of gamesmanship going on in that the applicant has never described what the end purpose of this application is beyond just pruning, which, as I said, is largely done and completed. And I say that because when I looked at the underlying Supreme Court case, not so much the appellate division case that reversed the Supreme Court case, I found something very interesting, which was in the counterclaim in the Supreme Court that the applicant here stated. They stated that their goal for this entire litigation was to improve and clear the walkway. They didn't at that time refer to it as an easement, interestingly. And to make it possible to construct a dock at the waterfront to Sam's Creek. So if he is in fact to construct a dock or a catwalk or steps down, as Mr. Shea said, I think the point that the board raised here about the trustees considering that makes perfect sense before that red maple or any of the natural vegetation is disturbed. Finally, I think that I do want to clarify the record. We heard the applicant say that the intended purpose of the so-called easement was access to Sam's Creek. I don't want to re-litigate, but it is important to note that in the Supreme Court and the appellate division, the actual contours and scope of the easement were never litigated. So I do think it's improper and overstepping for the applicant to state that the purpose of the easement was access to the Supreme Court. That is not in the plain words of the easement. And so I think that's for another day. But there are a lot of issues being raised here. And before we disturb what is that natural area and that old tree, I think we got to get a better sense of what the end goal here is and what the true intention is by this applicant. Again, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I am a relatively new homeowner in town, and I do respect the environment and I do respect all of the property rights at issue. But again, I thank you for having the opportunity.
Thank you.
Any couple comments?
In just a moment. Kevin, is there anyone else who wants to speak?
No one else on Zoom.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mark.
Martha Reichert again for the applicant. Just to sort of address a couple points that Mr. Silk raised, the language of the easement, because it is a partial interest and a right that's granted over to 4 different lots, is to have a pathway to Sam's Creek, right? And that is a body of water, so it's to the waters of Sam's Creek. Even though it doesn't say the water, it says Sam's Creek, which is a named body of water. So I wanted to just clarify that it is very clear in the instrument that grants this easement that it was described as being to access the water.
Do we have any physical copy of that?
Kelly does. I'm happy to give you some more copies.
No, Kelly has it, that's fine.
I'll send it to everyone.
It's better that Kelly have it.
And then the second thing is, I appreciate that he thinks I'm a better chess player than I actually am. It's one of those things where we came to this board first because it made the most sense to prevent the area from becoming overgrown again, right? An easement holder has a duty to maintain their easement so that it's not considered abandoned, right? The other thing is, with respect to the trustees, it's a little more complicated in terms of certain Blue Book regulations, and I won't go into that here, but that's why we came here first. There's not to be disingenuous. It really is to maintain that easement. The same as when any other applicant gets their 4-foot path to the water, right? Then they have it and they can establish and enjoy their riparian rights. In terms of what was said in the pleadings in 2013 about a dock, that's not what we're trying to do at this point. We're trying to, launch kayaks, get to the water, you know, perhaps have a drop platform, or if it's more beneficial for the wetlands, a floating platform. I mean, that's really something for the trustees to decide. As Marty said in his preliminary staff report, he recommends that it be through flow decking, which is exactly what the trustees require in their catwalk and dock regulations. So I mean, whatever has to be built to effectuate the intended purpose of the easement to get to Sam's Creek will be, you know, in conformance with the trustees' regulations and as mindful of the environmental considerations as possible. But, you know, it's not insurmountable, because we've seen that both neighboring properties to the north and the south have overcome the terrain to have their own ramp up, ramp down, and you know, docks.
Okay. So, did you want to speak?
Unless you guys have questions.
Okay. So we need to adjourn this. Now, there's two ways we can go, and a lot depends on just what you want to do.
Sure.
We can close this and grant a decision on those areas of the pathway up till a particular place there that does not include the slope. But then if the trustees don't take jurisdiction over that, then you're gonna come back to us with another wetland permit, another application to go through this process for that last little bit. It would probably be, unless you're in a hurry, probably is quicker just to adjourn this for a prolonged period of time, sufficient that you can decide what you want to do, make application to the trustees, and get a determination from the trustees, and then come back to us.
I'm inclined to agree with you, Harry. I think it would be better to adjourn it. That way we can begin
So-
a dialogue with the trustees.
So it may take more than 2 months.
It may, but in that case, we can request an additional adjournment.
Yes, it would be also nicer for us with our agenda to not plug up the calendar for something that's gonna get adjourned anyway. So if you think it's gonna take more than 2 months, I would encourage you to adjourn it for more than 2 months.
I'll let Marty wants to say something.
Marty, Chief Environmental Analyst for the town. Yeah, I just wanted to say that we really need to know what the trustees are gonna permit before we know what our options are with regards to that red maple. I would hate for us to issue a permit
Well, we're not going
that
to.
allows for cutting of that tree,
We're gonna get a trustee permit.
and then find out later that, you know,
No,
there
we're
are
gonna hear
issues
from what the
in
trustees
terms
say
of
first.
continuing the intended use at the trustees level. So, yes, let's adjourn it so we can get the essential feedback from
Yeah.
the trustees. The other option, of course, is to issue a permit that lets you to continue to prune and cut vegetation up to that red maple, and then we'll wait on the last part for the trustees to make a determination.
So, so we have, what's our calendar?
So if you want to go to 2 months, I'd say May 24th. If you want to go longer, just to be sure that you're going to get some headway with the trustees, so we're not going to be adjourning again. June 14th, 28th, July 20th, it says July 26th twice.
How long does it take to go through the trustees?
It kind of all depends, right? Matt thinks we could do 2 months, but
Is it based on the submission of an application or the issuance of a permit?
I don't actually know how long they're taking these days. So, Tom, if you,
It's the 12th and the 26th of July, it says the 26th twice.
so why don't we do the June meeting? Was that
Okay.
June 14th?
June 14th or June 28th?
June
Either one.
14th.
June 14th, okay, so it's roughly 3 months.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Okay.
You want a motion?
Yes.
We have a motion to adjourn to June 14th.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Advisory reports, Planning Board, 14 Flying Point Road subdivision, pre-application.
We don't need a quorum for this, please. Huh?
Marty Shea, Chief Environmental Analyst for the town. This is a subdivision that's in the pre-application stage at 14 Flying Pond Road in Watermill. There are several recommended advisory comments. First is that the subject premises for which two-lot subdivision approval is being sought is located on Flying Pond Road in Watermill. Parcel is located outside the town's wetland permitting jurisdiction and the town's water quality improvement zones. Two, their tract contains the 1883 Diamond House, which is eligible for listing on the New York State and National Register of Historic Places. The tract is being subdivided in order to divide the land into two separate plots, thereby allowing for completion of construction of a new larger dwelling where the historic home was formerly located. The Diamond House has already been relocated to the north part of the tract, consistent with the recommendations of the Landmarks and Historic Districts Board. Thirdly, the southerly portion of proposed Lot 1 contains several large mature trees, which is just beyond the footprint of the new dwelling, inclusive of a 60-inch diameter tree. While intended for preservation, the specimen tree has already been adversely impacted by root cutting, shearing, and excavation for the purposes of building the northeasterly house foundation, as well as by root compaction related to temporary stockpiling of soil north of the tree. These excess soils need to be carefully removed with the pre-existing grades restored in order to lessen oxygen deprivation and root hypoxia. Additionally, construction traffic needs to be fenced out away from the outer canopy drip line to avert further tree health risk and damage. And four, the remaining large trees on the side should be protected to the maximum extent practicable, as their presence adds to community character and can provide reduced household cooling and heating costs, together with carbon sequestration and wildlife habitat. Establishment of a covenanted tree easement may be beneficial in achieving these goals.
Motion to send those comments to the planning board?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The administrative wetland permits are in your packets. Resolution of conditional approval, A022028, Dennis Sokolich, and this is postponed to March 22nd. Is there a motion?
Motion postponed to March 22nd, 2023.
Moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
And opposed?
Aye.
A022091, Sandra Pessin and Norman Pessin. Any discussion?
Move the issue.
Second.
Resolved that a conditional wetland permit approval be granted to Sandra Pessin and Norma Pessin for the proposed project upon the terms and conditions set forth therein. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Preliminary review signature determination, A021076, Nicholas Christopher and Penelope Christopher. This is postponed to March 22nd. Is there a motion?
Motion to, go ahead.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? A022012, Giretti Fufa. This is postponed to March 22nd. Is there a motion?
Motion to postpone to March 22nd.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? A022054, Paul Bazuk and Lisa Gallo. This is postponed to March 22nd.
Motion postponed.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? A023003, 46 Oakhurst Road LLC.
This application relates to an existing residentially developed property at 45B Oakhurst Road in Hampton Bays. The application has been made in order to legalize various improvements that were undertaken without requisite wetland permits, as well as to seek reapproval certain activities that the board had previously permitted, but wherein the permits have since expired, as well as to allow for various additions and various enhancements in terms of the accessory structures. There is a preliminary advisory report on file dated March 6, 2023, that details all the various activities on the residentially developed property that need to be addressed. It indicates that the property has beach frontage on the Great Peconic Bay, wherein while the applicant has identified the closest wetland setbacks, those setbacks were taken from the summer beach and mean high water profile, which was considerably seaward of the winter beach profile, which is pretty characteristic of the Great Peconic Bay. We have a tremendous shift back and forth. The beach is filled in the summer months, and then in the winter months they get narrower and narrower. So my report does acknowledge the variability in wetland setbacks. There are no concerns with regards to the majority of the activities that either need to be reapproved, legalized, or which are being proposed, with the exception of an unauthorized, reconstructed, reconfigured, and enlarged wood dock at the terminus of a wood walk that provides beach access. It was rebuilt in an area of valued native vegetation, and further seaward than the permitted accessory decks on the neighboring properties. So I've asked that they scale back the extent of that existing dock to just provide essential access to the water, and that they also establish a naturally vegetated buffer extending 25 feet south of the northerly property line. Right now, this deck is anywhere between 40 to about 50 feet from mean high water and the winter beach rack line. But as indicated on the survey during the summer, it's at a considerable distance. But this would ensure that the development of this property is consistent with the residences on the abutting lots, as well as consistent with other Conservation Board permits that have been issued in this area. This is an application for which we have sufficient information to make a determination. As such, I'm recommending that the hearing requirement be waived.
Motion to waive the public hearing?
Second.
Resolved that the Town Conservation Board hereby waives the public hearing requirement pursuant to Chapter 325, Section 325-80 of the Town Code. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Covenant Interpretation Amendment A 02209591 Cobb Isle LLC. This is postponed to March 22nd.
Motion to postpone to March 22nd, 2023?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Thank you all.